When we talk about World War II and the War in the Pacific, I always kind of get a little bit of a chuckle out of the philosophies between the soldiers that were fighting in Europe, which has ended, and the soldiers that were fighting in the Pacific. Because the soldiers that were fighting in Europe used to always tease and joke around and be sarcastic about the easy life that the soldiers that were fighting in the Pacific had. And that was probably true when they weren't fighting, because I'm sure the beach life, that type of thing, would be more enjoyable than the scenery in Europe. But American troops that fought in Europe used to always joke about that easy life the American soldiers had while fighting the Pacific. And between battles, I'm sure the ocean environment was much better than that in Europe. However, battles in the Pacific theater of World War II were considered the most horrifying fights ever witnessed by man. Fights in the Pacific theater of World War II were considered the most horrifying fights ever witnessed by man. And probably that was because of the attitude of the Japanese soldiers and the Japanese military. Because these Japanese troops were taught by their commanders that loyalty to the emperor was the most important part of the war. They were taught never to surrender, to die before surrender. And if they were going to be killed, it was their duty to take out as many of the enemy as they could before they were killed. So Japanese troops were taught by their commanders that loyalty to the emperor was the most important part of the war. These soldiers were also taught that they were to never surrender. They were to give up their lives before ever doing so. And they were also instructed to fight to the final death and kill as many as the enemy as possible. Now, probably the greatest example of this were Japanese Kamikaze pilots, which is on your ID sheet. Japanese Kamikaze pilots. I'm sure you've heard of these guys, right? Japanese Kamikaze pilots. What do you know about them? Nothing?
They weren't trained pilots to commit suicide.
Yeah, actually what's weird about this is they were volunteers. They volunteered for this duty, and their job was to fly bomb-laden planes directly into American destroyers and aircraft carriers to do damage upon enemy ships, knowing, as Ryland said, that they were basically committing suicide in an effort to help their country fight the Americans in the war. They were volunteers, folks. I think about that. You know, would you volunteer for that type of a mission if all of a sudden we were in war? Would you be the first one to stand up and say, I'll fly that plane into the Japanese destroyers and lose my life? I think it'd be a tough call to get, tough volunteer basis. But that wasn't their mentality. We will talk kind of about this mentality in the Vietnam War. When we were fighting the Vietnam War against the North Vietnamese, they were much more willing to lose life than the Americans were. And that turns the tide in the war. And of course, we get in the Vietnam War, and we had protests over American lives. And you know, there are 58,000 Americans on the Vietnam Wall, which is the saddest thing you may see in your life. But that doesn't compare to the 1.3 million North Vietnamese soldiers that were killed in Vietnam. I mean, look at the difference there, right? Because they were willing to do that. Same type of thing as the Japanese. They were willing to give their life to the emperor. And I think that American soldiers understood that they were going to give their life. We saw the 17 minutes of the storming the beaches of Normandy at Omaha Beach. Those guys kind of had an idea maybe, right? But there was a chance. When you fly a plane into an aircraft carrier, you have no chance when it's full of bombs. So that was something that was just what they did. Now, the word kamikaze actually means divine wind, with a D, divine wind. So the word kamikaze means divine wind. And that's kind of a weird statement in a way. You're thinking, where'd that come from? Well, it actually came from a battle that Japan had with Mongolia many, many, many years prior to World War II. And what happened is the Mongols, or Mongolians, were invading the country of Japan, and they were winning, and all of a sudden a big storm came in, or divine wind, that turned the tide and allowed the Japanese to defend their homeland and win the war against Mongolia. So divine wind became kind of a spiritual name for the Japanese, and that's the name they gave their pilots, Kamikaze, or divine wind, in celebration of their victory over Mongolia when a storm came in and turned the tide in favor of the Japanese. Now that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is strategy in the Pacific and early victories. Strategy in the Pacific and early victories. I'm simply going to explain to you the American strategy in the Pacific Ocean against the Japanese. Now the man that will plan this strategy for the Americans in the Pacific will be American Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Somebody probably has him to write on, don't they? Who has Chester Nimitz to write on it? Or somebody does, okay? So the man that planned the strategy for the Americans in the Pacific against the Japanese was American Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. And his strategy consisted of a four-pronged attack against Japan. His strategy would consist of a four-pronged attack against Japan. Four-prong attack. Here's prong number one. The American air, land, and naval forces would strike all Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Prong one. The American air, land, and naval forces, will strike at all Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Don't you remember us talking about their land grabbing early, right? And they got all these islands in the Pacific. They got control of them for air bases so they could protect their homeland against attack. Well, the first prong of Admiral Nimitz's plan is to reacquire all of those islands in the Pacific that Japan gained control of to protect their homeland. Does that make sense? Okay. Prong two. An Allied fleet under the direction of American Admiral William F. Halsey is going to drive the Japanese from the Solomon Islands. Okay. Prong two of Chester Nimitz's strategy is an Allied fleet under the command of American Admiral William F. Halsey is going to drive the Japanese from the Solomon Islands. Where are the Solomon Islands by that we've been protecting for quite a while so far? Australia. So these Solomon Islands, we have to drive the Japanese totally out of the Solomon Islands to secure the fact that we can liberate Australia, or keep Australia from being taken over. Not liberate, because they haven't been taken over, but at least keep them from being taken over. So prong two is an Allied fleet under American Admiral William F. Halsey to drive the Japanese totally away from the Solomon Islands, protecting Australia. Prong three, General Douglas MacArthur is going to advance from Australia. Remember, he was sent to Australia by President Roosevelt, right? And what fell as a result of his leaving under the direction of Jonathan Wainwright? Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor, which were in total the Philippine Islands. Okay? So what the third prong is General Douglas MacArthur is going to advance with troops from Australia, and they're going to regain control of the Philippine Islands, which includes the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor. And what's prong four going to be after they complete those first three? What? The attack on mainland Japan. So, prong one, air, land, and naval forces will strike at all Japanese-held islands in the Pacific Ocean. Prong two, an Allied fleet under American Admiral William F. Halsey will drive the Japanese from the Solomon Islands. Prong three, General Douglas MacArthur will advance with troops from Australia to regain control of the Philippine Islands. And when those three are completed, prong four, they'll have a final attack on the mainland of Japan. That will not happen because Truman will make the decision to drop the atomic bomb instead. Okay? That'll take us to our last subtopic of the day, which is American victory at Guadalcanal. American victory at Guadalcanal. Now I want to explain what Guadalcanal is. Guadalcanal is one, folks, one of several islands in the Solomon Islands. Okay? Guadalcanal is one of many islands in the Solomon Islands, which are by Australia. Now, we are finally going to gain control of the Solomon Islands by the end of 1943. But before we do that, we have to win an important victory at Guadalcanal. We don't win at Guadalcanal, we do not take the Solomons. So by the end of 1943, we're going to have an Allied victory in the Solomons. But in order to do that, we have to take Guadalcanal. So, in August of 1942, United States Marines launch a surprise attack on Guadalcanal, which again is in the Solomon Islands. So in August of 1942, United States Marines launch a surprise attack on Guadalcanal, a very important island in the Solomons. And this Guadalcanal campaign was fought for 6 months on ground, at sea, and in the air. This campaign or battle at Guadalcanal was fought for 6 months. August, September, October, November, December, January, February. 6-month campaign. It was fought with ground troops, it was fought at sea, naval battles, and in the air with airplanes. Both sides, the Allies, especially the Americans, and the Japanese took many, many casualties in this fight for Guadalcanal. So the Guadalcanal campaign was fought for 6 months on the ground, at sea, and in the air, and it took its toll on both sides as both sides suffered heavy losses or casualties. Finally, by February of 1943, the Japanese had suffered too many casualties, many more casualties than the Allies, and as a result they withdrew from Guadalcanal. So the Japanese suffered a far greater toll of casualties, which forced their withdrawal from Guadalcanal by February of 1943. Now, because of that victory at Guadalcanal in February of 1943, we were able to secure all of the Solomon Islands by the end of 1943. Does that make sense? But we had to have Guadalcanal. So our victory at Guadalcanal in February of 1943 allows us to sweep through the Solomons and gain control of those by the end or December of 1943. Now, I want to go back to November 13th, 1942, during this 6-month battle, right about in the middle of this 6-month battle. What happened on November 13th, 1942, during this 6-month battle for Guadalcanal, an American ship called the USS Juno was severely damaged by a Japanese torpedo. On November 13th, 1942, in the middle of that 6-month campaign in Guadalcanal, an American ship called the USS Juno was severely damaged by a Japanese torpedo. And because it was damaged, it retreated from battle, or tried to retreat from battle back to friendly ground to get repaired. That makes sense? Unfortunately, as it was retreating back to get repaired, it was hit by a second Japanese torpedo. So on November 13th, 1942, during the 6-month battle for Guadalcanal, an American ship, the USS Juno, was severely damaged. And during the ship's retreat for repairs, it was struck by a second Japanese torpedo, and the ship sank in 30 seconds. From the time it was hit by that Japanese torpedo, it was underneath the water in 30 seconds. 30 seconds, folks. Now, we don't know for sure, but there were approximately 683 men aboard. Approximately 683 men aboard. Of those 683 men that were aboard, 568 were killed instantly on impact of the torpedo. Okay, of the 683 men aboard, 568 were killed immediately, leaving 115 men where? In the ocean, stranded in the ocean. Okay, so 683 men on board, 568 killed in that first 30 seconds of explosion and sinking. 115 survived, exposed to both dehydration and shark attack. Shark attack. Of those 115 survivors, 10 live to tell the story. 10. So those 115 survivors, 10 live to tell the story. 10. Can you think of a worse death than being killed and eaten by a shark? I mean, I can't even imagine. That would be horrid. I'm going to list 5 of the, not that they weren't all important, but I'm going to list 5 men that were killed either in the initial explosion or died being one of the 115 that were in the, okay? So we'll give you their names. These are just 5. There's many, but I'm going to give you 5. First, George Sullivan, age 27. George Sullivan, age 27. Next man, Frank Sullivan, age 26. Frank Sullivan, age 26. Third man, Joe Sullivan, age 24. Getting goosebumps here telling me the story. Number 4, Matt Sullivan, age 23. And number 5, Al Sullivan, age 20. George Sullivan, age 27. Frank Sullivan, age 26. Joe Sullivan, age 24. Matt Sullivan, age 23. Al Sullivan, age 20. Thomas and Aaliyah Sullivan lost all 5 of their sons that fateful day of November 13, 1942. Thomas and Aaliyah Sullivan lost all 5 sons that fateful day of November 13, 1942. The brothers insisted on not being separated during the war. They volunteered, they weren't drafted, and because they volunteered, they had the choice to serve together on the USS Juno. They had the choice to serve together on the USS Juno. So the brothers insisted on not being separated during the war because they volunteered, choosing instead to serve together on the USS Juno. This historic story that occurred on November 13, 1942 was the basis for the fictional movie Saving Private Ryan. That's where it came from, where the submarine goes. It was a fictional movie, but was it not about the loss of 5 brothers? Okay. I'll show you a short little video and then we'll be done for the day. Now you're gonna hear some discrepancies on the numbers on deaths and whatnot. I've researched this a lot. I can pick up 10 different sites and get 10 different numbers. So you'll see a little bit of a discrepancy, but it does tell the story. It's a 3-minute. What I want you to do in your notes is maybe write